Thank you all for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome to the stage STEM education expert and science broadcaster, Dr. Aoibhinn Ní Shúilleabháin, for a conversation with our Hamilton speaker for 2021, Professor Caroline Series. Thank you both very much.
So, afternoon, everybody. For those of you that are joining us online, we have been having a wonderful Hamilton day so far in the Royal Irish Academy. We've had a masterclass with Professor Series, and this is our interview where we'll talk a little bit more about her experience in mathematics and get a little bit more insight about her own research field. But to give her introduction, first of all, Caroline Series, Fellow of the Royal Society, is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Warwick. Following her first degree at Somerville College, Oxford, she won a Kennedy Scholarship to Harvard University in the USA, where she did a doctorate in mathematics. Returning to England, she held a position at Warwick from 1978 until her retirement in 2016, and in 1992 became the first female professor in pure mathematics in the UK. She now lives in Hertfordshire, but remains actively involved in mathematics. Her early research was about the connections between the geometry of hyperbolic surfaces and chaotic motion. Her more recent work is largely about the geometry of three-dimensional hyperbolic manifolds and their associated fractal limit sets. One can get a taste from her book Indra's Pearls, which is co-authored by David Mumford and David Wright and published by the Cambridge University Press. Caroline has served the mathematical community on many committees, both national and international. She also has given many distinguished public lectures, including the Royal Irish Academy lecture later this evening as well. She's known for making her research and that of others accessible to non-experts. Throughout her career, she's taking a leading role in encouraging women mathematicians, and in 2014 was the first vice chair of the International Mathematical Union's Committee for Women in Mathematics. She was also a founding member of EWM, European Women in Mathematics. Her work has been recognised by numerous awards, and in 2016 she was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. She was President of the London Mathematical Society 2017-19, and in 2021 was awarded the LMS-IMA Crichton Medal in recognition both of her mathematical work and her outstanding service to the mathematical community. So, Caroline, thank you sincerely for joining us today, and I hope everyone will join me in giving you a warm welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that lovely welcome. And I would like to say it's a great pleasure to be here today in front of some real live people, and welcome to the people who are joining us online as well. Great pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Caroline. Now, I can't pretend to understand your research in pure mathematics. It focuses, I've read, largely on hyperbolic surfaces and three-dimensional hyperbolic manifolds. Could you describe that work for us, for those of us that don't have a background in mathematics?
Right. Well, hyperbolic geometry, which I'm going to be talking about this evening, the easiest way to think about it is geometry on a certain very special kind of surface. It's a surface that's everywhere shaped like a saddle. So imagine you're at the top of a mountain pass at the Col, and you've come up, and in front of you, you're going to go down on the other side into the next valley. And on either side, rising up here, there are two peaks on either side of you. So you're in a sort of saddle. And hyperbolic geometry, you imagine a surface that's got that shape everywhere, and it's very precise. It's exactly the same amount of curving, and that's described in a very precise mathematical way, everywhere. So in some sense, it's the opposite to a sphere. On a sphere, you're all curving downwards everywhere if you were on a point on the sphere, and it's curving the same amount everywhere. So hyperbolic geometry is curving in this other way, but every point is exactly the same. Well, you might say, well, why should I care? So what? Well, the first thing about it, hyperbolic geometry was discovered just about exactly 200 years ago, and it was discovered in the search for understanding one of Euclid's famous, Euclid had these famous axioms of geometry that probably many of you studied at school, and one of them involves a statement about lines meeting eventually at infinity. It's called the parallel postulate. And because it involved the question about would these two lines ever meet or not, it wasn't something that you could go out and measure or anything, because you had to go on infinitely far. And so for 2,000 years, mathematicians were trying to get rid of this assumption. They didn't like it. They wanted something simpler about, I have a point here and a point here. I can just have one straight line between them. But three brilliant mathematicians at the same time, independently, said, well, what if the reason nobody can succeed in doing this is because maybe it's not true? Maybe you can have lines, so you can have a line and a point, not on the line. Maybe you could draw lots of parallel lines through this point that never meet, this one you started with. And they discovered that actually, you can have a whole system of geometry that's a bit like spherical geometry but different, sort of the opposite, which is completely consistent and in which, as it later came to be understood, space is curving, but everywhere space looks the same. Wherever you move, any direction, it's always the same. And this became a fundamental idea, the idea that we're not living anymore in necessarily space that's got rigid Euclidean geometry, as philosophers have been trying to tell us, insist. Actually, space might be curving. And it led through the 19th century to developments of differential geometry for those who are mathematicians, Riemannian geometry. It was the geometry that Einstein needed when he came to formulate, first of all, special relativity, and then general relativity, that space-time is curved, that mass, somehow gravity is caused by mass imposing a curvature. And so without this preparation, almost a bit philosophical, we wouldn't have had the mathematical techniques for Einstein to be able to call upon. Then in the 20th century, it was discovered that, as I'll explain in my lecture tonight, I won't try and explain it now, but most surfaces, complicated things like donuts with many holes, in a certain way naturally are associated with this kind of geometry. And it became a very important tool for understanding the structure of possible curves on surfaces. It became a model for what later became called chaotic motion, which I'm sure people have heard of, the theory of chaos. So Parr's motion can be deterministic, but it can look random. And then, I'm going on a bit, but in the 1970s, a very brilliant American mathematician, William Thurston, took it into 3 dimensions and discovered that actually you could do almost the same thing for 3-dimensional complicated, what a mathematician would call a manifold. So that led to a huge flourishing, and that's sort of when I came into the subject, all sorts of ramifications of that. So maybe that's enough.
That's so much. Yeah. I really wish you had been there when I was an undergraduate student, and I really would have understood.
Like this in my lectures.
It would have been really helpful. Thank you, Caroline. I had planned my questions in a different way, but you explained that so well. Is there something that is, more tangible in the work that you've done and helps other people kind of, I guess, develop an interest in it? Because there is something visual about it that, it's philosophical, deeply philosophical, because it's in an imaginary space, but there is a visualization. Do you think that helps in the abstractness of what you work on?
Yeah, I think that was, what attracted me to it very much. When I started out in research, I was doing a really abstract subject, very abstract, and I got sort of tired of that because I said, we're throwing away so much beautiful stuff, geometry. Some of you may know the Escher pictures of devils and angels, where you have a disc and then there's these devils and angels tangled up in an Escher kind of way, and it's obvious there's a kind of symmetry there, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is because it's not normal. It's not just like an ordinary repetition of the same thing. Well, that's a visualization of hyperbolic geometry. Again, I'll explain more in my lecture. So Escher was a genius in his way. He managed to make these pictures. When you go into 3 dimensions, it becomes yet more difficult to draw, but you can draw beautiful pictures of if you have both the mathematical and the computing skills of what it would look like to make a sort of symmetrical patterns in 3D hyperbolic space. And again, as I'll explain tonight, if you sort of imagine your pattern in a glass ball and you look from the outside, you see wonderful fractal pictures. And it was really at the beginning of the time when mathematicians were beginning to harness the power of computers and computer graphics to draw some of these pictures, which had been theoretically known about since the late 19th century, but finally people could explore them in a more systematic way. Mm-hmm. Beautiful pictures with spiraling and complications, and you can see there's a symmetry, but you don't know what it is. And that's what attracted me. And I said, I want to understand what these things are about. I kind of thought that somebody must know. I mean, of course, people knew how they drew them. But I thought, well, why is the circles there and why is it like this? And no one could tell me. So I spent, the next so many years trying to figure out. So it was certainly the visual thing that somehow grabbed me about it, yes.
And I love hearing that, because I do think that when we're younger and before we get daunted by the mathematics, it's those types of patterns that really pique your interest in it. So you're one of the few that went to find out why that was the case. I read a lovely quote from you, Caroline, which says, "Mathematics exists in our minds, and yet it gives us such a powerful way of dealing with the external world." Can you maybe talk a little bit more about what doing research in mathematics is like, and what it is that makes you go on keeping to do it when it is that slightly intangible? You probably get annoyed by people going, well, how can we use it in the real world? So what does it mean to you to be doing this research in the mathematics space?
Yes, people say to you, what do you do when you're a mathematician? Are you inventing new number systems? Well, not exactly, no. Are you just calculating more and more and more complicated sums? Not exactly, no. So I'm, I suppose, a pure mathematician. I don't do things directly related to the real world. But you see, well, actually, my research for the last 20, 30 years has actually largely been inspired by seeing computer graphics that somebody has made and seeing features in it that I couldn't understand, I couldn't explain, and other people couldn't explain, and trying to pursue what that might mean. And the ground laid by this William Thurston, he introduced an enormous number of wonderful concepts, and he was a very visual person, although it's all sort of in high dimensions in his head. He made it all so tangible. So you see something you can't explain, but because the computer has printed something out where there's obviously something going on, it kind of grabs you. I want to try and see what that's about. And you have all these different ways that you might be able to approach it. This particular subject, there are many different angles that you could take, many different theories that sort of feed into it. And it's the challenge of trying to see, well, what aspect should I try and play with to try and make some headway in this? So that's a bit like what it's like. Of course, they say you need to have 100 ideas at least to have one that actually works out. It's, every day. It's not so easy. But yeah, that's what keeps me going, I think.
I love that you just used the word play, that you're getting to play with these ideas. Yeah. And also that you've said you have to have 100 ideas for one to work. And I want to reference this back because I hadn't realised that this was William Thurston's research, but he also wrote an article based on how we teach mathematics and how a lot of people don't necessarily have positive experiences of mathematics. So what do you think about that? Should more of us be experiencing the geometry element of maths at an early age? Should we be encouraged to maybe visualise it more and emphasising the fact that, well, as mathematicians, you fail a lot before you get a good idea, but that's really part of the process of learning.
Yeah, all of those things a bit. So as I was telling the students in the masterclass, I think I first fell in love with mathematics through geometry, and I think it's a great shame it kind of went out of fashion, because for me, it's the sort of relationships between things. Somebody tells you, well, these angles are the same over here, and way over here there's two lines that are supposed to be the same length or whatever it is, and you've got to trace through the connection. And to me that was very, you learn the kind of rigorous process that you've got to go through, but at the same time you've got to have the imagination to make the leap to see, you know, there's a million things you could try, and you've got to find the chain that works. I think one thing that happens in maths, it happens to a lot of people, it can be at school, it builds on itself so much. And if you miss a bit, you know, you're asleep, you're away for a week, whatever, you never quite got that concept, it makes it extremely difficult to catch up, and because it's built on itself. It's not like you missed out reading this poem so you couldn't understand the next poem. And I think, or you had a teacher who wasn't very good at explaining or said something even a bit wrong, and you struggle and then you give up. And that happens, I think, it's a great shame. It happens to a lot of people. So I think for people teaching maths, you want to, I think it was Thurston, she said maths sort of goes in spirals. It doesn't go in a straight line. You want to go round and round, and you learn something and then you get a bit further with it, and then you come to understand the thing a bit more deeply. There's also an idea that you teach something, you've got to teach the whole lot at once. You haven't. So Thurston was very good at giving a sort of an idea at some level, and then, you know, he'd have more students at a higher level, and he'd tell them in a more complicated way. And then he'd just throw out ideas. I mean, he was a remarkable man, completely remarkable. It was a privilege to have known him.
I'm sure it was. Caroline, you spoke about the imagination required there to, you know, do that research in mathematics. And I think it's something that we often think when we talk about STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths. Well, STEM is one thing, and then we have the arts. And you have to be creative to be in the arts, but you don't have to be creative to be in STEM. What do you think of that cultural message that often gets portrayed?
Well, I can only speak about being a mathematician, but you have to be very creative. It's hugely creative and imaginative, and it's a bit like trying to write a poem within a very strict, you know, a strict rhythm, a strict poetic form. So you've got all the freedom in the world to write whatever poem you want, but you've got to keep to this precise rules, or this haiku, whatever. So mathematics is sort of wonderful because you have these absolutely inviolable rules of logic. It has to be within the framework of logic, and it has to be rigorous. But on the other hand, there is so much out there, and it could be applied to so many different situations. If you're doing applied maths, you have a real world problem. You've got to try and discover the important features of it to abstract and try to write down in your formulation to work with it. So I heard, I can't remember who it was, but I heard a wonderful quotation recently. It was something from a very distinguished mathematician. He said, all mathematicians, or we mathematicians, we have a sort of split personality. We have a nighttime mathematician and a daytime mathematician. I love this. So by night, you're sort of lying in bed, you're imagining all these wonderful things you might do. You have sort of fantasies, you know, this wonderful play you're going to write or whatever. And all these things are connected in your brain, and maybe you're trying to do calculations in your mind, but you make little mistakes, you miss out half the detail. But you have your ideas. And then in the morning you get up and you're in the cold light of day. You have to try and write it down on a piece of paper, and you have to go through the rigorous process. And of course, most of the time, what you dreamt in the night was far-fetched and wrong or didn't work or whatever. But when you wake up in the morning and it works, which has happened to me a few times, it's like Hamilton on the bridge, honestly. It's just wonderful. You've got an idea and you sit down and it works and you write it down, and you know, and then you maybe get someone to do some computing for you, and you feel just wonderful. So Yeah.
That's lovely. I've never heard that analogy before. It's like writing
but this
the poem.
night time, it's exactly how I work. You lie awake at night. It's very hard. You've got to sort of let your mind go free, but balance it with kind of keeping a control on it. And I'm sure, I in fact do quite a lot when I'm walking. I well understand why Hamilton was on this walk. Because I'm sure he'd been thinking, he'd been trying to develop this idea, he had this intuition, but he couldn't make it quite work, you know. He'd been deeply, deeply thinking about it, and then he goes on this long walk, and suddenly, boom. And I've heard mathematicians describe discovering other things, modern people, just in the same way. Just all suddenly falls into place. So, yeah.
Thanks for that, Carl. I think actually Paul McCartney said that he woke up with Let It Be in his head.
Okay,
So
there you are then.
there it is. There's the creativity in STEM right there.
Yeah.
Can you maybe share maybe the meaning of, you know, you speak to people who do mathematics or who have studied mathematics, and they say, you know, mathematics is such a beautiful subject. But to those of us who perhaps only experience mathematics as a textbook and these exercises that I have to do, the idea of that being beautiful is just very foreign to them. So could you maybe describe to us that beauty of math? You've done it so well already, but when people say maths is beautiful, what do you think that they're trying to ascribe there?
It's so satisfying because things all fall into place. It's a bit like when you're doing one of these interlocking wooden puzzles. You're trying to get all the pieces to go together, and you fiddle and you fiddle and fiddle. And then finally something happens and it all just fits. What you thought was impossible, and it's there, and it's a sort of perfect thing. It's a little bit like that. What I do is beautiful visually, in a sense, but it's just a kind of deep satisfaction about seeing how all the pieces fit together, maybe bringing things that are quite disparate. Or people have a very clever idea and a proof, and I don't know whether people will have heard of the Fields Medal, which is said to be the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in mathematics, given to a young mathematician. And the first and so far only woman who's won this is called Mariam Mirzakhani, who sadly died when she was only just over 40. But she actually sent me a draft copy of her thesis, and I looked at this, and she was actually working on something which I had thought about, which is why she sent it to me. But she had such an original idea of starting at a completely different starting point, taking a formula and, well, again, for those who are mathematicians, she integrated it over a certain space. She said, well, this formula is sort of unchanged as we change all these surfaces. This fact remains the same. I can therefore integrate over the space of all surfaces. And she does it, and she comes out with something new. And I was just thinking, how did that, you know, I'm still astounded when I think back to that. How did she come to that? It was just remarkable. And then, of course, she integrates. She had quite a complicated integral, and she didn't write much explanation. She would just write junk, 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 and I'd spend, you know, several hours trying to figure out how on earth did she do this, right? And I met her, and I mentioned one particular thing. How did you do that? And she says, oh, I just looked it up in tables. I was doing it the good old-fashioned way by hand.
That's lovely, actually, to hear her mentioned in this, because, you know, she is such a role model in mathematics as the first woman to win the Fields Medal. We still know there's a lot of gender discrepancies among the sciences, and really the PSTEM subjects, you know, physics, mathematics, engineering, computer science. Now, you wouldn't know it from today because, you know, the majority of girls or the majority of the award winners from our institutions today are girls, which is great. But can you talk to us, Caroline, about how that situation has changed over your lifetime of being a woman in mathematics, and maybe tell us about your role in the organisations for women in mathematics to promote that gender parity?
It has changed. I think I'd like to go back a bit before my generation, actually. The generation before me of women had real obstacles. There were rules that said, you know, we can't employ a woman, women couldn't get degrees even, or you can't go on working there because your husband is working there, or you aren't allowed to use the library because you're a woman, whatever. My generation, there was nothing like that. But there were very few women, and there were even less role models, obviously, because of going back. So in my year in graduate school, I think there was about one woman in every year out of 12 or so. And my first consciousness raising, you might say, it was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We were told there's going to be a meeting of the Boston Women in Mathematics Association. So several of us went, and we found ourselves sitting in the floor in somebody's house, tightly packed with all these women who were all in various ways studying, teaching mathematics. And they were talking about this association. And it was just, you know, it was amazing, all these women there suddenly. And the few of us girls went back and we said, right, we're going to gather together a bit. We talked about what we do. We decided we were going to, as graduate students, we would start having a series of lunches to which we would invite undergraduate girls. And we did that, and I got to know other women through that in a similar situation. It was very nice. This American group, within a few years, had formed into what's called the Association for Women in Mathematics, which is now a huge American organization. So years went on. I went to one of the international congresses of mathematics in 1986, and this AWM had invited a number of women from different countries to be on a panel discussion that they organized during the Congress. And there were 5 of us from Europe there. And after the discussion, we got together and we said, we should do something like this in Europe. We all belong to this American thing. Why don't we have our own thing? And that's what we did. So, and sort of miraculously, we came back to Europe. We organized various meetings, and we kept it going, so I was one of the first people. So it's now called European Women in Mathematics, and it's still going strong, which I'm proud of, as a meeting every couple of years somewhere in Europe. And that was like, it wasn't campaigning, it was just so you could meet some other people like yourself, discuss your problems, feel relaxed. And we had this network, and I would be invited to somewhere because, you know, I knew somebody in Oslo, and she'd say, come and, you know, I know a good person to invite to give a talk. And it was like a network, and it was really quite good. So the international thing is much more recent. That's within the last 5 years. So at the same time that Mariam Mirzakhani won the Fields Medal, for the first time ever, the International Mathematical Union, which is like the international body, that sort of professional body for mathematics, it coordinates all the national bodies. For the first time ever, they had a woman president, very distinguished woman called Ingrid Double-Cheese. And she wanted to get them to make a section of their website to be resources for women mathematicians. And I was one of a small group who was asked to try and gather material and organize this website. So I got involved in that. And then I and a French woman, Marie-Françoise Roy, who I'd known from founding EWM, we said to ourselves, look, we've got a woman president in the IMU. It's not going to last. Let's get them to set up an international committee while we've got their prestige and resources. So we sort of lobbied, and Ingrid was there to help us. So we did indeed get a committee to set up, and it was pretty well resourced. And we decided that the thing we wanted to do to start with was try to coordinate groups of women in various, particularly developing countries who, you know, there are a lot of women doing mathematics out there, they're just sort of isolated. So with our funding, we gave funding for projects where women could have a conference or get together in some way. And that's been going for about 8 years now, so that's what that's all about.
And there's definitely progress. We have a female president of the Irish Mathematical Society at the moment as well, which is great.
Yes.
And I think that is the first time in Ireland. When we're talking about gender, and there's other disparities often with mathematics where people from maybe lower socioeconomic backgrounds don't tend to pursue maths, probably because they haven't had the same opportunities to study mathematics in secondary school and things like that. From your experience and your work, what would you like to see done to make sure that we're making mathematics accessible as a career path, maybe for everyone?
I think it's partly actually just the awareness that it's there as a career path and all the huge amount of opportunities, doors it can open. So, it's not that everyone has to go off and be an academic research mathematician, but there are just so many things you can do with mathematics now. And I don't think there's a very large amount of awareness in the public. I mean, maths is just involved in just about everything nowadays, really everything. So it's encouraging people to keep going, not to give up. In the London Maths Society recently, we've had I think they're going to do it for the second time this year, a short meeting called Black Heroes of Mathematics. And they've invited there are very few black mathematicians. A number of Indian ones, very famous Indian mathematicians, but very, very few black. Although the president of the
American Mathematical Society.
The president of the IMA, which is the sort of applied side of mathematics in the UK, he's a black industrial mathematician currently. But that's a whole area that we're trying to encourage and just give people a few role models and a bit of encouragement and show, I don't think it's because mathematicians are very welcoming and, it's just to get people to come through the door somehow, show them there's a possibility there. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Caroline, for being such a positive and generous and warm role model, and for all of your time today, and for speaking so passionately and so enthusiastically about mathematics and about your research. Thank you very much.
Thank you.